Welcome to Sifted Talks. We're just waiting for attendees to connect to the Zoom audio. So bear with us for 5 seconds or so, please. But we're very excited to be giving this talk today in partnership with Vanta. So I'll just wait for all the attendees to come through, and then we will formally begin, and I'll introduce what we'll be talking about today. Okay, so welcome to today's Sifted Talks in partnership with Vanta. I'm Maya. I'm a reporter and podcast producer at Sifted. I focus on UK tech and have a particular interest in tech policy and UK AI companies. Today, though, we are talking about expanding into international markets in the age of AI. We will hear about how AI helps and how it hinders, as well as advice about when to expand, when not to, and how to ensure compliance when you do. As always, please put any questions in the chat, and I will try and get through as many as possible. There will be no standalone Q&A section of this discussion, so we will kind of take these on a rolling basis. So please don't wait until the end to put in all your great questions, because we won't do a standalone section. I'm sure you guys are not here to hear from me, but rather our fantastic panel members today. So Harry, starting with you, could you just explain who you are, what you do, and why it's relevant to today's discussion?
Yeah, sure. Hello, everybody. My name is Harry Clark. I'm one of the GRC Subject Matter Experts at Vanta. Excuse me, I've got a bit of a cough, so I'm recovering from that, unfortunately. Previously, I've worked in counterterrorism policing with Virgin Media O2 as their senior risk governance and third-party manager, and then more recently for Accenture as a cybersecurity consultant supporting UK government. My role at Vanta is to support customers on their compliance journey, providing GRC specific guidance and helping them gain trust through regulatory and industry compliance. And today, kind of my role is to talk about things around compliance and how compliance changes when you shift into new markets and new industries.
Fabulous, thank you. Ciarán?
Yeah. Hi everyone, my name is Ciarán. I'm the CPTO at Protex AI. We build camera software for workplace safety and operations, identifying risks and inefficiencies in the workplace before accidents and the cost of those inefficiencies kind of take place. We work with some of the largest warehousing and manufacturing companies in the world, and our footprint is it spreads from APAC right the way across to the US. Super excited to be here today.
Fabulous. Tim?
Hi everyone, my name's Tim, one of the co-founders and CEO of Yonder. We're a consumer fintech that offers a rewards card and also a discovery platform for members to discover lifestyle experiences in their cities. We're based in London, but serve customers across the UK and our Netherlands as well. And I did a bunch of international expansion at the prior startup called ClearScore, where I launched ClearScore into South Africa, India, Australia. So I have a lot of war stories of international expansion as well.
And Céline, last but not least.
Cool. Hi, everyone. So my name's Céline. I'm the Chief Revenue Officer at Veed. We're an AI video creation platform built for social. We operate globally, primarily a product-led growth motion, but also a sales-assisted one. When it comes to international expansion, have had the pleasure at every company I've been at. So 2 London-based companies, including Veed, and then 2 San Francisco-based companies, both experience with a very deliberate country-by-country approach and also a much broader kind of let's launch, see how it goes, take it from there. So I've seen both sides of it.
Amazing. Thank you, guys. And just a reminder to any newcomers, please put any questions in the chat and we will try and get through as many as possible. There'll be no Q&A standalone section, so we'll deal with them on a rolling basis. Okay, starting just a question for kind of every panelist. As we all know, AI promises to make global expansion both more fast and more cheap, but speed without structure can be costly, as I'm sure Tim's war stories attest to. So I want to start by asking you, what do you think the biggest misconception founders and startup operators have about what international expansion actually involves? Harry, given you've got a fairly good bird's eye view of this, would you be able to start?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of like when companies move into new markets, new industries, whether it's geographic or other things, often there's this misconception that the compliance frameworks, whatever that you've got within kind of home soil, is applicable everywhere. And you kind of have this notion that I've got this framework or I've got this certificate, so I can go and trade in a different area of the world or in a new market. Particularly with AI, everyone's kind of in this position where they're racing now to try and get some guidance out about what we should be doing around AI. And then, that is a challenge in itself. But again, what we're going to see as that settles, people are going to be like, well, I'm compliant with the AI law within the US and therefore I'm compliant everywhere. That isn't going to be the case. It isn't the case at the moment with a lot of if you look at GDPR, you've got the US data protection laws, which is slightly different to GDPR. There's going to be crossover. We kind of know that. But I think it's sometimes a bit of a shock when you go and then you kind of have a business meeting with another potential customer in a different industry, a different geographic location. And suddenly they're asking for something you may not have heard of or you don't know about. And you're suddenly kind of 6 months back because now you've got to get that in place and you don't know what it is and you've never heard of it. So I think that's kind of the misconception, I think, from the start sometimes is that once you've done something within home soil, that is going to be applicable everywhere. And that often isn't the case. But I mean, these guys will be able to attest to it better than me from a kind of founder perspective.
Céline, you look like you're really nodding in agreement there.
Yeah, I think it's the entire space is getting a lot more complex very quickly, right? And I think here just mentioned the AI regulation that's happening in the US and the UK, for example, but in the EU, in South Korea and Indonesia, it's kind of coming up everywhere. And I think it can feel very overwhelming. I know it certainly does to me from time to time. And I think a lot of what you're trying to do is just sift through where should you care, where should you prioritize. And I think the kind of upside of going global faster is you can see where there is demand and where there is kind of like natural product market fit or at least interest, and then you can help prioritize what frameworks you should be prioritizing and where you should focus and where you should make sure you're compliant. But it's a rapidly changing world, and as Harry alluded to as well, like everyone's sprinting right now, and you can move a lot faster with AI, which is great. But then the regulation can really feel as though it can slow you down quite quickly.
Great. Ciarán, what would you say is the sort of biggest misconception founders have?
For us, it's quite interesting because we sell to kind of Fortune 1000, Fortune 500 kind of enterprise customers, and I think they've just gotten used to buying SaaS products. The early 2000s, they've figured out that, okay, we need to put, security practices in place to actually bring SaaS technology in. We need to understand where our data is going. We need to understand where it's being processed. And I think they've just gotten to grips with that, and suddenly we're trying this whole new shift of what technology can do and what technology actually is on front of them. So many of the conversations we have with respect to some of the kind of global scale rollouts that we do are really just educating the clients that we're working with, having conversations with them, sharing what we know about the market, where we see there to be grey areas, where we see it to be black and white. And that conversation for us has maybe been quite nice because it helps us get closer to their compliance teams, closer to their security teams. But I think the biggest thing for us at the moment is this maybe like inconsistent education across the fold of what AI is, what it can do, and kind of what type of legislation or regulations we actually need to care and worry about behind the scenes. So for us, the way we think about it is our clients are figuring it out while we're figuring it out. And as a startup, we're maybe a small bit more ahead in terms of how fast we can move. So we try to play that kind of sharing of the education in those conversations.
Great, that's really interesting. And sorry, last but not least, Tim.
I think one of the biggest sort of misconceptions is that you can just like copy and paste your product. I have this kind of philosophy, which is like you have to find new product market fit. I think what's interesting is like when you first build a product in a market, you have no product and you have a market that you're starting in, and so you can kind of mold the product. I mean, the goal as a founder is to do whatever it takes to mold the product to that market and find product market fit, and hopefully you're successful. What's interesting is that when you go to a new market, you won't automatically necessarily find product market fit because the market looks different. And so then you have this really interesting tension of how much do you adapt the product to find new product market fit versus just say you should find another market. And I think that's kind of like a bit of the art and science of it, which is there's a bit of a judgment call, right? Certain products need to be fully localized for a market. Some can be completely global. And it really depends on the category. I don't know, let's take something like TikTok. You can sort of launch that globally-ish. There's some cultural differences, but relatively easy. Fintech is famously very painful to go across borders because there's regulation, there's consumer behavior and payment rails, there's a lot more to do. And so you have to kind of like make some choices on, do you really want to build it bespoke for that market, or do you just want to say, hey, it's not worth it, we're just not going to bother making that market work? And so that also plays in when you have like a two-sided marketplace as well, because you have to then think about, do I want to build that out in every market? Uber famously had launch teams. Uber actually isn't that global a product. You can't switch on Uber globally. The app can, but the thing that makes Uber special is having drivers and riders in each market. And so they had to have, they called them launches. They were 20, 30 something year olds that would go into the market and find drivers, find customers, and like start the flywheel in each city one by one. And it was a huge lift. And I think that doesn't change. And that's more of like a structural thing on how your business actually works. And so I think that's probably the common misconception. I think when you go global, it looks really different depending on the kind of business you're building. And you have to find new product market fit in each market.
Brilliant. And I'm sure we'll kind of get into later in the discussion the sort of perhaps the overblown promises of AI and why you can't sort of necessarily just like automate product market fit, even if it can be useful to kind of work out, to identify where you might have good and where less. Tim, on the prep call we did last week, you kind of spoke about the tension between going too early and going too late. For you, what made moving Yonder into the Netherlands feel like the right move when it did?
Yeah, I think this is like a really classic, really difficult problem, which is, it can often always feel too early because your core market, you always want to make it more profitable. You always want to grow more. There's always a lot to do. There's obviously the natural one where you've tapped out your TAM, then you go international. We're not in a business where our TAM is anywhere near saturated. We're barely scratching the surface. I think the other way we thought about it, though, was there is a like inherent problem where if your core market is doing, I don't know, 200-300 million revenue, and you try and launch a new market, it's actually like really practically hard to invest in that new market because the organizational immune system says, hey, like, what's the point of this tiny market that we're doing less than $1 million in revenue for when we have 300 million, 500 million revenue in our core market? And so you sort of have to think about like the organizational immune system problem. The second dynamic as well is there is just an element of time to find product market fit. You can't throw a couple of that problem, and there are many countless examples of great companies really struggling to find product market fit in a new market. And there is an element of just being there long enough is a factor. Monzo tried the US, super successful company, put quite a bit of capital in there, couldn't crack it. They're a great company with a great team, great capital available for them. But there's an element of it just takes time to find product market fit as well. So I think there's a couple of other domains you have to think about. And I always kind of think about the idea of you want to have your sort of plant your seed in that new market before you need it. And so when it's ready and when you've tapped out your TAM in your core market, well, you've had 3 to 4 years or whatever in that new market, really learning and building the muscle. Now, I think it depends on how difficult it is to build internationally. I'd say that's the caveat for a company like ours, which is a consumer fintech, where there's regulation, there's language considerations, there's a lot more work you have to do to launch a market. I think if you're building a pure like SaaS product that is ubiquitous, then like go global from day one, right? I think at that point, like don't even think about should you go global or not, just go global. But I think the companies where you have to go and do an element of build out in each market, then I do think you need to be more thoughtful, but don't go too long because otherwise you'll struggle with the organizational immune system. But then management attention is a factor. If you split across too many things, you then have management attention problem as well. So I always say that no matter what you do, you'll always feel like it's a bit too early and you always feel like it's a bit too late.
That organizational immune system is such a nice phrase. Ciarán, Protex is live in about 30 countries, is that right? how much does what Tim says there, how much does that speak to your experience?
Yeah, so I think the challenge we had early days is we were maybe more so pulled into that rather than that being a choice. We're an Irish-based company, and Ireland is a very small country, so you're very quickly forced out of the island, maybe out to the US or out to the UK. In our case, we went straight to the US. And a lot of the companies we work with, they have a global footprint. So as they start to roll this technology out, we implement it in the US, and it works. And we start to roll it out. The rollout is usually across multiple different regions, different countries. And the kind of attention problem that Tim touched on there is definitely real. I think specifically with the product team and the kind of compliance teams and trying to figure this stuff out as we go. One of the biggest challenges for us early days was we also ship hardware, as we have servers that actually go on site. All of our processing is done on-prem for privacy and security reasons for these kind of large companies. I'm not sure if anyone in the attendees has tried to import a GPU to Mexico, but it's a really hard thing to do. So there's all of these kind of logistical challenges as well that come up, and understanding the different labor laws, import laws, etc. And that, I think, propagates to the team as well. I think Tim makes a really good point as to how do you protect the team and keep the team focused on driving value where we have it, and maybe pull a small SWAT team aside as we start to go to new countries to figure out labor laws, compliance laws, importation taxes, etc. So for us, it was maybe we were pulled into it more so than it being a choice. But then very quickly you need to adapt and figure out how to make it work.
Harry, I imagine that you see quite a lot of startups who are similarly sort of pulled into it. What advice would you give them, and what do the best outcomes, what choices are they a result of, and perhaps what are the worst outcomes a result of?
I think, in terms of talking about like going too early, from a compliance standpoint, this will culminate or show up as like a series of silent failures. So essentially things will look like, they're fine from the outside, but they're accruing risk and it's maybe not visible, which is obviously, quite concerning. By the time the company kind of realizes a problem, they're typically within an audit window for something that they need or they've committed to. So you commit to this stuff. Ciarán makes a good point about being drawn into stuff. Like, I don't know, I like compliance because I'm a bit of a GRC nerd, right? But I don't know many people that start a business and the first team they set up is the compliance team because you want to develop something, right? So this is, there's often a challenge around like, do we have the people that we can dedicate to do it? Is it cost effective for the business model? So that becomes a challenge. And yeah, you're right, you get drawn into stuff, you just get pulled into, okay, we want to go and trade in this country. Then there's all this other stuff that just kind of lands once you start going down that path. And often it's legal, right? So you don't have a choice. You've got to comply with this stuff. So I think in terms of like, so initially I suppose like around like red flags and stuff, or flags, where if a company doesn't have a legal entity in the target market, that can be really challenging. Because if you're processing that customer data, the home country setup may not cover them. Regulatory mapping, that's also something that's really important. Kind of doing your impact assessment across different markets and geographies as well is really important. Knowing which data protection laws apply and which sector specific licenses are needed. Knowing the classified differently, classifications may be differently as well. So a low risk tool in the US could be a high risk AI system under the EU AI Act. All that stuff, it will come about, when someone tells you or someone asks you, and then you kind of go on this journey to try and find out. And often that's kind of the cost of fixing stuff later rather than getting it right at entry. Remediation is typically more expensive as well than prevention, and particularly in regulated markets. This could be company ending in some cases, with really strong kind of regulation. But I suppose like in terms of advice, the test, or when I speak to customers, if your legal team can't name the relevant data protection supervisory authority, that's probably a bit of a flag. And you need to be able to understand the kind of data transfers processes and stuff. Excuse me. With Vanta, we can demonstrate our tooling, obviously, and that often gives you an indication of and where you are within that kind of compliance journey and where the crossover is, and identifying those big gaps and those things you need to focus on. So I think, yeah, have the conversations. There's a difference between going too early with like an audit and going too early with compliance. I would advise that you go as early as you can with compliance and start, getting things like policies in place, understanding the regulations. What we typically don't advise is that you go, right, I want to get certified in a week and I'm going to get my audit booked in for next week, because you're going to try and, somewhere you've got to fit 3 months into a week. So, for that prep time. So it's kind of taking an impact assessment around what you're moving into and then understanding and building it into your business model. Compliance, I'd like to think that compliance is becoming more and more of an enabler around business models. So it can enable you to trade internationally. It can enable you to move into different markets. So I think if the shift in mindset is there around actually compliance is giving us we pride ourselves at Vanta around giving you a trust center. So it's about building trust in your customers, being transparent, open about what you've got, where you are with your posture for compliance, and typically security and privacy and things like that. So building up that really good kind of trust posture will massively enable you. And that's probably what I would say. Try and build that, but build compliance into your business model rather than treating it as like an add-on. If you treat it like an add-on, you will never dedicate anyone to it. I mean, you guys can say, if you've got someone that's going to go and build a product that you're going to get money from, or someone that you're going to dedicate to doing a load of compliance work, you need to understand that that's still driving revenue somewhere, but it needs to be built in the business model. Otherwise, it's an add-on, and that's where we see, kind of point in time certifications, things like that are a real challenge, because the day after you've had your audit, things could drastically change. You may not be compliant. So yeah, that's kind of what I'd say.
Amazing. Yeah, Céline, how does that sort of resonate with you and Veed's sort of approach to compliance when expanding into different markets? I feel like you've said before that you took quite a high risk tolerant approach. Looking back, is there anything that you'd do differently, or what actually did work?
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to kind of give that some thought. I think what Tim said earlier was interesting too, right? Of like, if you have a software or a product that's more like a TikTok and can be consumed at scale globally, it's pretty tempting to go global, right? And I think Veed is an AI video creation platform. Yes, there are nuances to every market, to every customer size, but it can very much be a global product. So I think that's what drew us to expanding globally out of the gates. But of course, I have to keep compliance in mind. I think that was more of a definitely thought about like the core markets where we had to be compliant. So UK, US, Canada for us are some of our core ones, as well as the EU. So all of that is very much very, very top of mind, and we take a considered view there. But if you think about our smaller markets where revenue is quite low, well, I can't say with confidence that we're looking at all the compliance frameworks in those markets, right? So I think maybe what's different about more of a consumer platform and tool is that you are able to get early market signal very quickly, very early, and then that helps guide you on where you should go deeper. I think from a go-to-market perspective, something interesting is just because you're present doesn't mean you're competing. And I think that you have to be compliant and security first, compliant first in the markets that you care about in order to put your best foot forward, right? So if one of your biggest markets is California, well, California has specific data protection regulations that you might want to be thoughtful about. Or if one of your biggest markets is the EU, well, then there's also different flavors there. So I think that does matter. And then the thing I'd probably add on too is just because you can access software and pay for it self-serve doesn't mean that your sales assisted motion is going to kick off in that market as well. They typically want to be able to speak to people in time zone, which AI can help with, but in time zone. And they also typically want to grab a coffee, chat through various things in person as well. So I think it just depends on, again, the product that you're selling, the contract size that you're dealing with, and the complexity of your product and how much like PII you're processing, et cetera. So yeah, complexity to it. But I think for our market and our stage, made sense to go broader, faster, and then think through the different geographies after that.
Right. I'm wanting to now begin speaking about how AI can be used as that sort of expansion engine. We've got a good question on the chat from Peter Gillingwater, asking if you guys have used any agentic tools apart from the obvious LLMs specifically for international expansion to validate key metrics, competitive analysis, and GTM support. Tim, I remember you said that you built out your Netherlands market with just 2 or 3 engineers in 2 months. So maybe you're a good person to start answering this question.
Yeah, I think honestly there we did just use the standard LLMs. I think a lot of the classic like McKinsey report that you might pay to get, market sizing and things like that is a ton easier. Having a Claude or ChatGPT or whatever to go and build out some of that reporting and analysis for you as well. So we definitely leaned on a lot of that sort of classic market research type stuff using quite frankly just like foundational models. And then in terms of the engineering team, I would say that the biggest unlock was, in general, obviously the engineering team is just much more productive. And so I would say like LLMs haven't fundamentally changed the truths of international expansion. What they've done is just made the core inputs easier. So it's like, drafting legal documents or reviewing things or translating things a ton easier using an LLM. And so a lot of the heavy lifting is just being taken up by an LLM that can help automate a lot of these things. Speaking to customers, LLMs don't automatically do that for you. They can help you, but that part you still have to do yourself. So I think I would say that it doesn't make the hard parts of international expansion easy, which is, ultimately finding the right talent, building the product there and finding product market fit. Those are still hard. But a lot of the inputs have become significantly easier. And I would say that they've become more efficient. So we kind of think about LLMs have been like an efficiency multiplier, not necessarily an effectiveness multiplier thus yet. Like that hasn't all of a sudden had this huge insight while an LLM's like, hey, you should launch in this market and here's why, and it suddenly just worked gangbusters. That I think is still the hard work of finding product market fit, going out, talking to customers and things like that. But the input's a ton easier. And as we managed to launch the entire business as a regulated company in about 2 months. So that's become a lot easier. And so I'd say that part's become easier, but some of the other stuff hasn't become easier.
Yeah, Ciarán, Céline, do you have any sort of experiences of your own time?
Yeah, from our side, I think it's somewhat of a double-edged sword, right? You get for macro market analysis, it's fantastic. If you're like trying to get answers super fast and come to some conclusion fast, it's a really good thought partner. I think the slippery slope, as maybe we've seen, is what happens when that starts to be adopted by the team and it's not adopted in a similar way across the fold. And so you start getting lots of ideas, lots of input to the lots of signals that you're trying to process internally. So some of the massive wins for us have been, we're a Dublin-based company. We also have a kind of a US headquarters out of Boston. So a lot of our commercial team is based out in the US. A lot of our support team, our engineers are based on the European time zone. So what happens when, over on the European side of the Atlantic, we're all asleep and, the US team are trying to answer questions. So thinking about how you're actually building machines to enable your business is maybe what we've pivoted to in the last 6 months. How do we stop using these as quick wins to solve specific solutions and think a bit more strategically about what are the systems that need to be true in 6 months' time if we're going to be able to solve that problem on time zone answering questions. If that's the case, what data do we need to have in place internally? How do we need to structure our data? So all of these kind of foundational, you should have good documentation as a startup as you scale. That becomes very true for companies that are trying to enable themselves with AI. And for us, I think that the most challenging part is how do we learn collectively as a team, but also how do we figure out what works and then enable the team on what works and maybe more importantly on what doesn't work and maybe getting that message across as well.
And how easy is that decision to put, X amount of time a week aside to kind of fix those systems, which have those sort of effects 6 months down the line, but aren't the sort of instant gratification stuff that we all love?
Yeah, for us, it's definitely there's folks in the engineering team that gravitate towards just playing around with the tools, experimenting, and naturally engineering teams are going to be the early adopters of this technology in terms of Codex and Cloud Code and integrating it into their engineering workflows. I would say we've had some success in leveraging some of the folks that are just naturally curious and naturally looking to understand what new tools are out there, what new models are released, and how can we actually hook that back into the business. And um, so right across the business, it's maybe stemmed from engineering, but then there's always going to be champions internally that we've had a legal that is very AI first in terms of the way she thinks about legal and how you can enable legal with AI. So for us, it's been finding the champions internally, getting together, giving them freedom and space to be curious and explore, but then creating some sort of structure to actually pull that back in once we come to conclusions to then enable the wider team.
Great. It's a really useful sort of playbook. Céline, do you have any agentic AI recommendations, or more broadly, just AI tools that have been sort of, a lifesaver when expanding internationally?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's probably like the tools you hear about it around and the use cases you hear about it around. And I think it's a lot of it is the go-to-market tool stack that you've been like leaning into in a SaaS world, and now it's just becoming agentic and able to operate without you having to push the buttons. So I think a lot of that is the outreach capability, right? So powered by things like Clay, for example, or making sure that you have. So what we're building right now is more of like an agentic experience for the kind of lower value sales, where like a deal would typically go sales assisted. Like, how can we actually enable those people to buy on their time zone without having to speak to a rep, right? So can they have a custom demo in their own time zone environment, what they need, so they don't have to wait, the 12 hours to speak to someone in a different time zone? Because our team is mostly in Europe, but we also have folks in the US. But if you're in Australia, there's going to be a lag. So I think it is like looking into those use cases, like how can you automate different parts of your business where you don't need a human necessarily. And I think that also plays into customer support a lot. So we use Fin, for example, the intercom product, and that's important to us as well. So if someone does not have to wait for a human to answer their pretty straightforward support query in their time zone, then that helps too. So I think a lot of it is just like the typical business functions that we've all been operating in for a while, and thinking through like, what's the AI layer to this? What's the agentic layer to this? And how can you kind of just get that moving a lot faster? So as always, no silver bullets. So like if you turn it on, it's going to fix everything. I think what we're saying is pretty consistent of like, it can make it more like faster. It can definitely build it faster, but it's not going to fix the foundation or fix the inputs to the problems that you're solving.
And when sort of beginning to implement these tools, have you faced any like hiccups, or has it been pretty smooth sailing?
Yeah, of course. And maybe like this is experience from a past life and less so from Veed, because we adopted AI for customer support really quite early on at my last company, and it's a full-time job to train it, right? I think that's like the learning curve that we've all probably learned right now, which is like the robots don't control themselves. Of like you have to very much like feed the beast and make sure they have the right data, and it is coming up with all sorts of new job titles, right? Of like jobs you like have never heard of before, but it is now like important that they exist in order to keep the AI running and always correcting itself and scoring the responses, etc. So I would say that the dream is that it just like does the work for you, but someone still has to like manage the AI and give it feedback and make sure that it's continuing to improve. So I think the biggest like realization is that you always have to keep iterating on it and improving the outputs, and that it's not, maybe we'll get to a point where it's all like self-fulfilling and scoring itself, but from what I've seen, we're not quite there yet, and we need someone to be dedicated to improving the workflows.
And would you say, Harry, that the sort of compliance issues that founders and operators might encounter when using AI to scale are ones which can be sorted out if there are enough sort of team members who are dedicated to, overseeing how it's being used and what it's actually producing?
Yeah, I think so I was kind of thinking of like the analogy around kind of the differences like between the AI regulation type stuff and typical kind of compliance, typically security and privacy and things like that. And bear with me on this, but basically we got a puppy last year and we did all the prep stuff, right? We prepped the house, we did all the kind of controls. So we put all the barriers in to stop him from doing stuff we didn't want to do, which is kind of like your typical security compliance type stuff. So you put all these controls in place and then you bring dog home, Obi, his name is, you bring him home and he just goes mental and he just does whatever he wants. So like Céline said, it's really important that you train them to do what you want them to do, but you still have to train them to not do stuff. And there's a massive risk around drift, right? Particularly around things like automated decision making. So the GDPR has articles around this, around how you make decisions with legal, or if you're making decisions around legal or anything that's going to have a significant effect on individuals. So like credit assessments, hiring tools, anything like that. There's like specific obligations around explainability, around transparency, and all that kind of stuff. So this need to keep a human in the loop, make sure there's human reviews, is really important. And I think there's this real kind of balancing act to be had around how do we make it do what we want to do, give it the amount of freedom it needs to do what it needs to do to make us productive, but also not take over the company and shut everyone out. Right. So it's really interesting. And when you speak, I watch podcasts and bits like that. And you hear people talk, like AI experts talk about, there's always this question of, could it take over the world, or could it become out of control? And if you look back at things like Google Willow and all that kind of stuff, there was edge cases where it looked a bit kind of hairy at times. So, and no one said no, it can't. So they're kind of like, we're 99% sure it's kind of fine. So it's really important that you don't open yourself up to kind of like GDPR failures, data breaches, all that kind of stuff that you don't even know about, because you've kind of got this new employee that has essentially not learned how to be an employee, not trying to learn how to be a person. You have to do all of that. So yes, it's challenging, right? But I think if you do your impact assessments and kind of, I typically say to people, you've got to work within the box, right? And start small and work out. If you just try and go really broad, or things like people, I've seen companies where they've just basically allowed any employee to download any AI tool they want. There's vendor due diligence you need to do. You need to treat these things like not just like software vendors. They're slightly different because they've got a lot more power. So you need to be doing your impact assessments based on that kind of stuff. So I think, yeah, like understanding, I mean, the EU AI Act, you have to have a lot of governance in place. You have to have lists. You have to know what it does. It's a scary place to be if you don't know what it can do, or what it is doing, and things like vibe coding. I hear talk for vibe coding all the time, which is great if you're kind of really risk open and you want to develop and kind of move forward. But it's a bit scary if you don't know how something's been built. So suddenly you've got this kind of element. So you need to make sure there's kind of controls in place that address all that stuff. But yeah, it is a challenge. But I think it's just Céline nailed it when she said, you need to train it. And I was thinking, yeah, you kind of need to train it to a point, and then train it not so you meet in the middle with exactly what you want, which is challenging, and it can change, and you don't know, you need to know what people are doing. And you have to have the ability to like kill it if needed. So you have to have a kill switch in. And that all those kind of things. So it is different for AI. But yeah, apologies.
I was thinking of your puppy analogy. So when you said kill it, I was like, no.
Well, yeah, I mean, I wish he had like a pause button, but a kill switch maybe not. I don't think my wife would be very happy. But yeah, but it is kind of like, yeah, you there's like another step, right? There's this kind of add-on bit of you can't let this thing just go crazy. And you have to have those controls in place. And one of the things, I think we talked about on the pre-chat was like the consequence around a slow failure versus a fast failure. AI hasn't made this thing, it hasn't made it things change. It just means that the failure is going to be bigger and faster. And it's going to land sooner. It's going to come when you get investigated by the ICO under something, or whatever the AI Act is going to be using for their kind of enforcement. So my advice would be just try and understand it, make sure you have a list of everything. You should have documentation. Like the EU documentation heavy compared to other areas of the world, but it's important that you've got all this stuff listed, and you wouldn't employ, like I said, you wouldn't employ someone and then not know what they're doing and just give them the keys to the kingdom. Do you know what I mean? It's kind of that notion. You need to be thinking of it like that, which is different to, I think, how we've looked at the compliance prior to AI coming along. But also, like I said, going back to build it into your business model. Your AI business model should include a level of obviously security, compliance, privacy, all that kind of stuff built in, and make it part of your kind of enablement strategy, rather than this added bit that's going to say no to everything or stop stuff.
Sure, and that leads us on quite nicely to Alexander Everett's question about whether the panel thinks the regulatory burden of Europe has become our selling point for data protection and GDPR risks over AI firms operating in the US. Harry, would you like to begin on this if your throat's holding up?
Yeah, can you just read the question again for me?
Yeah, let me just, it was essentially whether Europe's regulations are, and yeah, the extent to them are Europe's selling points for data protection and GDPR risks compared to the less regulated AI firms operating in the US.
Yeah, I mean, possibly. I mean, the EU typically goes quite heavy on this stuff. It's very, firm on regulation, which is good because you're getting a decent quality of kind of compliance around this stuff. If you look at GDPR, a lot of the other privacy frameworks in the world use that as a baseline, so they kind of feed off of it. So I would imagine that a similar thing's going to happen with the AI Act, and it is one of the first that's kind of, there's some areas of the US that have got specific state like laws or I think state regulations or laws that they're bringing in around AI, but there isn't anything that kind of broadly oversits the whole of the US or anything. So I think it is a selling point, and I think you've got ISO 42001. That's an ISO framework. It's an AI framework. It's designed to help you be as or get on the start of your kind of compliance journey to the EU AI Act. Having it won't give you like the full kind of regulatory compliance, but it's a good percentage of the way there, and that gives you a nice badge as well. So that's your kind of ticket to say this is our privacy badge. This is how good we are with kind of AI. That is probably more important, I would say, because it's kind of a globally recognized framework, and then you kind of look at your deltas depending where you're going to be trading. But yeah, I think it probably is an enabler, a sales pitch, a sales point, enabler, I would say. I mean, I don't know, Ciarán, Céline, or Tim, if you've got any thoughts on this.
I think for us, we've seen there have been many conversations we've been in where the client on the US side, realizing that we're a European company, has maybe slightly just changed the conversation in a more positive way when it comes to compliance. And I think, Harry, it goes back to what you said a little earlier, in that if you're looking at compliance as a tick box, as a checkbox, and kind of going out with your ISO cert or your SOC 2 cert or whatever it is, and using that as a tick box to wave, then I think you've probably done it all wrong. And figuring out how you can be transparent about where you are in that journey. I think what we've seen is that it's really helpful when you're talking to compliance teams, large compliance teams that have maybe 50, 60 people reviewing the documentation that we send over, being transparent as to where we are, where we're going, and some of the things that we've learned along the way, especially around the EU AI Act, where again we've kind of been in the position where we're kind of educating folks on what it is and what it isn't, where the gaps are, how it fits to what we do, and maybe how it slightly doesn't fit in some respects. But I'd definitely say to go back to the question, for us, leading with the fact that we're a European baked company, and as a result, some of the expectations of a European company, again, it doesn't give you this checkbox that just because you're a European company, you're compliant and you're better than everyone else. It's not necessarily that. It's more, I think, the environment, that the cultural environment, but also the kind of regulatory landscape that we're kind of, building companies in, forces you to think a small bit harder about, okay, what do we need to care about here? How can we actually build this inherently into the product, into the business, as opposed to it being we're going to this market, and so we need to get this search to check this box. I think for us, we were quite lucky early on to have some amazing folks join us that maybe led with that mindset in terms of, this is an enabler. This is something that becomes a selling point. It's obviously important. But the way to get the commercial team on board, the product team, the engineering team on board, is it needs to become part of the selling motion. It needs to become part of who you are as a business. And so to go back to the question, being a European company has given us that, okay, cool, we need to care about this stuff because the environment that we're brought up in, that we're building the company in, really, really cares.
How does that, Céline?
Maybe to chime in, I think agree. In a lot of cases, the EU bar is the highest bar, which is great. So I think being based in Europe is an advantage because you're more mindful of it. I do want to think of like the flip side of that. And I'm not sure like how early stage your companies are. I think they're probably like a little bit more advanced than say like a 1 or 2 person company. I'm grateful at Veed as well. I think what's on my mind though, advising earlier stage companies is like what is also the burden to startups in Europe to be compliant. And I think that is just what we need to be mindful of is like the bar in the US is so much lower in order to like start a business, get going, get some feedback from customers. Again, that's changing, right? New York, California, it is changing, but I think that's just like the flip side of like if the bar is really high in the EU, then how do you also encourage, incentivize, make it easy for early stage companies to get to that bar? And that's just, yeah, very much on my mind because you see it impact entrepreneurship in Europe, right?
Great. And Tim, from a sort of fintech perspective, which is obviously a very regulated industry, do you kind of think that AI regulation is moving in a direction where it might eventually look something like the sort of financial regulation that Yonder has to navigate today? Do you think that would be put European businesses in a good position?
Yeah, I mean, in general, like I'm sort of pro proportional regulation, which is a nice way of saying like there are costs. Every time you regulate something, there is a cost as well. And so, yeah, I would say like there is a cost of not having anything, but there's also a cost of having it. And so I think to Celine's point, it's becoming a bigger challenge now where the regulatory burden becomes larger and larger and larger. And you know, keeping in mind the regulatory burden is the same whether you're, so it's not the same, but the percentage, the burden is large when you're small. And it will, it's not like it suddenly becomes less when you're small. It's not suddenly like, hey, you're a 5 person startup, you don't need to worry about GDPR. It's like, oh, you don't have to worry about AI regulation, it's still there. And so I do worry a little bit, and the best positioned companies to be able to handle heavy regulation are the big companies. So you end up crushing innovation, and you end up crushing the ability for companies to move quickly and build like generational companies. So, you know, I would say like I'm definitely not anti-regulation, but I also I also would like to highlight that there are costs to it, and there are real costs to the innovation economy. There are real costs to consumer choice and things like that. And you know, there's a whole rhetoric now in the UK around how do we start to like make regulation more pro-growth again, because like there are costs and they're not free. And I think people can often see the cost of not having it, but then not realize there's a huge amount of cost of having it as well.
And in that sort of ideal world, do you think that sort of proportional regulation is about maybe removing penalties for smaller and medium-sized businesses, or just removing the sort of rules in the first place for them? What do you think? Sorry, this.
Yeah, I mean, I think the problem is like putting rules on something that's a moving target is quite tricky, and it's oftentimes you don't have the counterfactual. Again, this is like super cultural, right? So then you start getting to like, oh, what's the right amount? I don't think reducing the fines is going to be helpful though, right? Like that's not the because the second you do get some sort of intervention from a regulator, you're not in a good place, right? Like it doesn't matter whether there's a financial cost there. The management cost and attention that goes to that is so high that the fine is like important, but not even the most important thing. It's actually like the burden it puts in the organization. I think what's interesting, right, is if you're building a startup, especially if you're like starting off from scratch, you're trying to build to solve a customer problem. And then all of a sudden you have to deal with GDPR, AI regulation, financial regulation, on top of just doing the one thing, which is hard enough, which is like raising capital, building a team, and finding product market fit. And so I do kind of worry about that, right? Because ultimately, if one of the big agendas across the EU is driving more growth and more entrepreneurship, well, that's a massive killer to that, right? It makes it very difficult for anyone to get started because not only do they have to solve the fundamental problems of startup building, they have to solve a bunch of regulatory issues as well. So, you know, I don't know. I do worry about the direction of travel. I think there's some general recognition across the sort of political spectrum that, hey, we need to be a bit more thoughtful about this now. And I think the risk is that we overregulate it to a point where we no longer become a credible player in the AI ecosystem. And you end up just continuing to see giants come from China and from the US because, you know, ultimately the EU is no longer competitive in an AI, you know, global market because we've overregulated.
Yeah, there's quite an not nice, but interesting tension there between regulation on the one hand being European companies' strengths, but also obviously hindering their abilities to grow, or hindering the abilities of lots of them to grow. Ciarán, you've got quite a nice perspective on the US-European kind of cautiousness divide, whereby, in some European markets, clients wouldn't make a buying decision until every sort of compliance box is ticked, as I'm sure Harry knows, while US players might have a bit more risk appetite, bring a product in, figure it out as they go. How has that sort of changed your go-to-market strategy?
Yeah, I find it really interesting. I'm really interested in psychology and the psychology of how regulation affects how people buy and why people buy, and I think, Tim, you mentioned it in that the reason we started companies is because we're trying to solve a problem. And from the customer side, the reason they're buying one of our products is because they're trying to solve a problem. And so at the end of the day, we're all here because we're trying to solve problems. And when you blur the lines between the problem you're trying to solve and the process that you're putting in place in order to solve that problem, then it becomes a kind of quite interesting. So yeah, we've seen, interestingly, or maybe not surprisingly, some of the European countries that are maybe more, compliance heavy in terms of their culture, not just buying software, but their culture as a country, how they actually operate, how they make decisions as a country. That has kind of bled into some of the kind of conversations we've had around our technology being adopted in certain regions. For us, maybe it's slightly more complicated because we're working with large companies who have proprietary things on site, and then there's also PII in terms of the workers that are on site. And again, the approach we take is a very transparent one. We don't try and shy away from the fact that cameras in the workplace and identifying safety risks isn't something that a big and large conversation needs to be had. But I think that the insight that I'd maybe share is on the US side of the Atlantic. There's maybe just a more openness to engage in learning and understanding how they can shape the way they're trying to bring this technology in, as opposed to shaping it by the regulations that are already in place. And I think there's something to be said for, even going back to Tim's point on the smaller companies, the burden to actually be compliant is the same but harder, because there's less people to actually help to be compliant. There's maybe a similar thing that we're seeing in terms of who's actually influencing these regulations, who are talking to the regulators. Is it the small startups, or is it the larger tech giants, or is it the larger kind of conglomerates? So I think there's this interesting triad of, who's actually making the decisions here, where are the learnings actually coming from, and how are those learnings actually being fed back up to the people in Europe, per se, who are actually making decisions around how we regulate this, or even at the country level, how we kind of regulate what companies in our countries are actually bringing in.
Great. And Céline, during this discussion, I've often kind of spoken of the US as a kind of singular monolithic market. Obviously, that is not the case, as I'm sure you're very aware of. What have you found can make state-by-state expansion difficult?
Yeah, of course. So full transparency, lived in the US, but I'm a friendly neighbor to the north from a citizen perspective, but know the US quite well, and I'm sure you do too, because it's such an important market for all our businesses. I think the reality with the US is that it's not one country, or it is a country, of course, but it's made up of so many different states, and every state has its own laws. And so there's first like the compliance perspective, especially from a sales tax perspective, like how big is your revenue in each state, and are you actually filing in each state, and like making sure that you're on top of all of that. So that's a real treat. So I think that is one aspect to it. But the second aspect is like, it is such a diverse country, right? People from New York are not the same as people from California or the Midwest or the South. And I think from a go-to-market perspective, that makes things interesting too. So I would say it's worthwhile thinking through, like, where are you seeing traction? Where is your ideal customer profile? Where are they hanging out? Like, spending more time there. And again, like, would not suggest going this, like, investing the same amount in every metro or every state. That is not a recipe for success, but thinking through, like, where is your ICP? Where can you focus? So for us at Veed, again, we're targeting modern marketing teams, and those tend to be in the New York area, in the San Francisco area, in LA, and doubling down there. You can spend more there. You can put boots on the ground there, and that tends to make more sense. But I would say, yeah, compliance, not fun in the US. It's all very different state by state, but then also, like, each each state, each metro has its own personality, its own way of buying. So it is, yeah, very complex. And I think that's why we also see American companies can stay in the US for so long. It's a massive economy, but also there's a ton of complexity within the country itself. So understand why a lot of American firms stay close to home for a long time before taking on the EU. And you also see that when American companies come to Europe, right? They're like, oh, the EU, single market, fantastic. And you're like, no, no, no. There's a lot of complexity here too. So again, you learn by doing a lot of the time and see how complicated it is once you start operating there.
We've got a question from the audience asking, how exactly are you guys using AI for marketing? Céline, I feel like you're a good person.
I mean, I don't want to pitch it, but so I would say like Veed is an AI video platform. So that's like one way for sure that we're using it at Veed. So instead of having to go to a studio or do a shoot or even use real people, you can create pretty phenomenal videos from scratch just by using a prompt or an image. So that's definitely one way that we're doing it. And then I think a lot of it, like beyond that, is like building agentic motions, so like stringing different products together. So if you think about it, you could use a tool like N8N, and you could then like put your video together with your from Veed with your 11 Labs voices, with your whatever you want to use for outreach of a LinkedIn, etc. So probably like some tools I'd recommend checking out are very much like N8N, 11 Labs, Veed. Those come to top of mind, and then making sure that you have modern enrichment that's working for you. So that's everything from Clay and beyond. I have to be honest, of our CRM is probably a legacy tool at this point, but lots of cool new AI agentic CRMs that people who are just starting out should probably use instead of going into the depths of legacy CRM play. So yeah, lots of ways to use it. I think what's fun too about marketing is that the results can be pretty immediate, so you can see what's working and double down pretty quickly.
Brilliant. And I am aware that we are entering the final minutes. So I'm going to ask the classic prediction questions. Harry, do you have some predictions about what the next few years will bring for early stage, mid-stage startups in Europe looking to expand?
Well, I think, yeah, I mean, we're already seeing, like, as I kind of mentioned about like compliance becoming this kind of commercial differentiator, right? So rather than just like a cost center, we're seeing it in enterprise sales cycles, AI governance, data practices, security posture, all that kind of stuff. Like where you've invested in GRC infrastructure, deals are closing faster because you can automate more, you can move faster. So like Tim mentioned earlier about, essentially it can sometimes be easier to start in the US because there is less pressure around this stuff. The whole idea, the kind of journey behind where Vanta started was to get SOC 2 quickly, but concisely and properly, but to get it quickly and to utilize automation for that. So we're seeing that. And I hear people on calls now saying, we want to use this as part of our pitch. So I think that's going to continue. I think one of the things that I think we need to look at in the GRC space, and again, back to one of Tim's points, is like a compounding of controls. So Vanta is starting to look at it. I don't think within the regulations you're going to see one regulation that caters for lots of things. If anything, we seem to be in the EU and the UK a bit more reactive. So what we're seeing is these like more specific frameworks starting. So like things like DORA and NIS2 and things like that, really specific about the industry, and they're just looking at how do you respond and recover from a situation, which is a part of some of the biggest security frameworks, but now they're like delving into that. So if anything, we're kind of seeing this spread, and I think Ciarán made the point about who was actually speaking to these people about these decisions, and it is going to be larger enterprise companies because they can afford to throw people at it, and startups and founders aren't going to say, yeah, we'll release someone to go and spend time working on the next iteration of whatever the regulation is. So I really hope that, and Vanta's got some thoughts around this over the next kind of 12 months. But how do we have these like common control frameworks, right, that you could take on as a startup or a founder, and this will give you, you're going to be working within the EU. This will kind of give you all the controls you need to be compliant with these different regulations and frameworks. That would be really nice, I think. And it doesn't feel like you're having to understand multiple different frameworks, different regulations. The cost of compliance, I think, will continue to drop, which is a good thing, using automation in the GRC tooling space, moving from big compliance teams, reducing that. So hopefully smaller companies can kind of get on board, and utilizing AI, they can have their team of GRC people, but maybe formed as some agents and then maybe 1 or 2 people. So this could be a really good opportunity. But yeah, that's probably kind of it. I mean, the compounding control thing is the big thing, right? So how do we make it easy? It feels like we're just kind of introducing lots of new stuff, and somewhere there needs to be kind of, and I think it will at some point go the other way, but we kind of need this way to say, embark on this one journey and this will give you what you need to go and enter this market. That would be really nice.
It's a great place to end. Everyone is nodding in agreement. So you have spoken for the panel there, Harry. Thank you. Thank you to everyone who has joined, and I'm so sorry if we weren't able to get to your questions. Blame my timekeeping. Thank you to Tim, Ciarán, Céline, and Harry for all your great insights. Thank you to our partner Vanta for their support. And hopefully see you guys next week for our next installment of Sifted Talks, which is about how UK investment can transform European scale-ups on the 28th of April 2026. Follow the link that we're dropping into the chat bot now to sign up. Thank you, everyone. It's been a pleasure hosting this. Have a good day.